Well, good morning and a very warm welcome to this webinar that is being jointly co-hosted by Recolight and by the finishers and interiors sector. And as usual, we've got an awesome uh, panel of speakers who are going to be talking us through what they are doing. And we had a conversation last week about plans for this webinar, and I was amazed to hear what both Orms and Willmott Dixon are doing, not just in EPDs, but in wider sustainability actions. So I'm really pleased and looking forward to hearing what they're going to be talking to us. We are going to be, the webinar will run for about an hour and a half. The recording afterwards will be posted on the Recolight website, recolight.co.uk/webinars. For those who are registered, we will send a slide pack tomorrow via MailChimp, so look out for that in your inbox. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there are two sections that you have. One is the chat box. Now, please use that for sort of webinar admin questions to Suzanne asking about how the webinar is working. Any questions for the presenters, please put in the Q&A box, and that is the box that Iain and myself will be monitoring to put questions to the panel at the end of the session. So we're hearing first of all from Flavie Lowres. Flavie is Environmental Metrics Manager at Recolight and also Sustainability Champion at the FIS. She's going to be talking us through what EPDs are, how to get one, what they contain, and what manufacturers should be aware of when they create them. She'll then pass on to Rachel Hoolahan, who's an Associate Director at Orms. She's going to be talking us through a demonstration of building an LCA, why EPDs are needed, and at what point and what information is used to make them. And then she will then pass on to Dr. James Upstill-Goddard, who's a Senior Sustainability Manager at Willmott Dixon. And he's going to be drilling down more into what Willmott Dixon expect, what EPDs are asked for, how they help with clients' demand, and corporate strategy, and what information goes into the document. So a really good breadth of information from our presenters. After that, we'll have a Q&A, and as I say, we should all be finished by 12:30. So this is one of a series of webinars that we've held at Recolight. Another one on EPDs, a user's guide, the alternatives to Cat A lighting, EU environmental law, what the implications are for the lighting sector. And there's one further one planned for September, DC lighting. Is that the next step in sustainability? All of those are free to join, and as long as you register beforehand, even if you don't turn up on the day as a registrant, you still get access to the slide packs. Recolight is really thrilled to run the Circular Lighting Live conference and exhibition, now in its 5th year. It's chaired by Ray Maloney, and it really brings together an incredible series of presentations, discussions, and best practice in all that's great about sustainability and the lighting industry. So put the date in your diary, and tickets are available now. They're free for lighting specifiers, and there's an early bird ticket day tickets that are available until the 31st of July. So please look out for that. 8th of October in London. Also look out for other sustainability stories on LinkedIn and on the Recolight News website. That's through Circular Lighting Report that is edited by Ray Maloney. And any information that you want to send Ray for possible inclusion in that, send it to his email address at ray.maloney@recolight.co.uk. So that finishes my introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Iain to introduce the FIS. Over to you, Iain.
Listen, thank you very much indeed, Nigel. And everybody who knows me knows I love a bit of collaboration, and working with Recolight has been one of the joys of my last 2 years. So thank you very much indeed. So I'm Iain McIlwee. I'm Chief Exec of the Trade Body Finish and Interior sector, and our focus is the supply chain that delivers fit out and interiors work. And I'm also a director of SCAR Rating, which is, for many of you who know, is an environmental certification scheme that looks at project level, particularly focused on refurbishment. And I thank you all today for joining us on this discussion on EPDs and their growing importance in the built environment. As FIS, we deal with manufacturers, designers, contractors, and we talk a lot to designers and clients. And we've been asked increasingly difficult questions about how we evidence the choices we make. So I hope today's session is going to help us really start to fill in some of those blanks and understand, because we often hear that we're living in the age of information, but I generally think the quantum, the size of the information challenge that's now hitting construction is probably one of the biggest challenges we face on a day-to-day basis, or solutions to the challenges we face on a day-to-day basis, because the golden thread dominates the conversation, and it talks about information flows that are critical, supporting building safety. But with my two hats of sustainability and compliance, I see those conversations becoming very much one and the same. The green thread, the golden thread are very much intertwined, because they're about building life cycles, connecting decisions, and helping people manage buildings responsibly over time. And critical to that is consistency of information, right? So to make sure that we've got consistent pockets of information that we can successfully move through the supply chain, so that future generations who rely on this information, so we make better decisions in the now, but also that future generations who rely on the information that we're creating can make better decisions in the future. We're setting the futures up to succeed, not being lost in a muddle of, I don't know where the O&M manual is, I don't have any data, right, let's just strip the stuff out and smash it and chuck it in a skip. So the more information we can provide, the easier we can make the future, the more impact we can have now, and the more impact we can have in the future. So I'm really looking forward to today. Thank you again for bringing us into this, Nigel, and I'll hand across to our next speaker.
Good morning, everyone. So let me just share my screen quickly with you. So as Nigel has explained, I have a dual role. So there's no pressure for me today, because I've got my two bosses in the room. So that should be fine. So as he said, I'm working with Recolight. So I joined at beginning of March as environmental metrics manager, and I've been a sustainability champion for the FIS for coming up to 5 years now. It's interesting to have this kind of dual role in this presentation here, because I have got many years of experience of delivering EPD. And so that's going to be my role into Recolight. But in the FIS groups, we've our both our contractor side, but also with our manufacturers members, we talk a lot about the challenges of getting EPD, but also what we need to do to make them more consistent and etc. So hopefully this session will be useful to both sides. So through my presentations, I'll go through a bit of background, but also kind of explain what is an EPD, understanding them a little bit, going through the details of what they contain and how you can scale them up, how you can get EPD, and then give you a little bit of an idea of the services that are being offered through Recolight. So the built environment is responsible for large impact. And I thought you've probably seen some of these slides before, but it's always good to kind of remind ourselves, because some figures show that it's responsible for 37% of energy-related carbon emissions. So this is a figure coming from the United Nations Environmental Programme. Globally, it's a very large proportion of the carbon emissions, but in each country, those figures will vary, but they're always very important. But it's also responsible for 50% of the materials extracted on average across. I think this figure has been validated in Europe, and in the UK represents 60% of waste. if you look at the lighting sector, is responsible for 15% of electricity consumption. So this is the scale of the challenge that we're facing in the industry, and this is the reason why we need to act now and look into measurement about our impact. So the other thing that's important is that when we look into building carbon emissions, we often talk about two types of emissions, the operational carbon emissions and the embodied carbon emissions. Operational carbon emissions are the carbon emitted through the day-to-day activities of the building. So that could be through the heating, cooling, ventilations, powering of electronics and appliances through the buildings. And the embodied carbon emissions are the carbon emitted through the product life cycle. So from looking all the way from the extractions of the raw materials, the manufacturing process of this product, transport to site, installation, maintenance, and end of life. I don't know what I've done here. Some figures look at the proportion of operational versus embodied. And in 2018, the UK GBC created these figures of 71% of UK built environment carbon footprint come from embodied, the operational carbon emissions. This is reflected in the fact that we have got regulations for operational carbon emissions. We've got Part L, for example, of building regs, and that has been understood for quite a long time. The newbie on the block is really the embodied carbon emissions. And the reason is because as buildings, the new builds are more energy efficient, the grid decarbonizes, and as buildings in general become less dependent on gas, but maybe more reliant on electricity, which can be decarbonized, then the proportion of operational and embodied will change, and the balance will change. And therefore, it is important that we start to look at the embodied carbon emissions as well. So this is what we will be talking about through these presentations. The embodied carbon emissions of buildings and products, so both, are calculated using life cycle assessment method. So if we look at what a life cycle assessment is, it's a method to quantify the global warming potential and other environmental impacts through the life cycle stages of a building, a product, or a system. So it's very visually, you have to picture the kind of all the different life cycle stages of the product, all the way from its cradle, so materials extractions, transport of this product to a manufacturing point, so that's called the cradle to gate, and then looking into what happens next during the use phase, during the removal of that product, and during the end of life. So life cycle assessment is a methodology that can apply to every product you want, from a pen, a bottle of Coca-Cola, or a ton of bricks, or a luminaire. And those are done in accordance to ISO 14040 and 044. But an EPD is the next stage. Is basically an EPD is an environmental product declarations, which is a third-party verified LCA of a construction product in line with ISO 14025, but also EN 15804. Okay, so EPD were created very much for construction products originally, but we are now seeing a growing number of EPD being created for different products. So they could be created for example, smoke alarms, air source heat pumps, luminaires, and etc., because those are products that are actually going into the building. So if you think about what we mentioned earlier, looking at the life cycle assessments of building and some products, the data from the products go to creating the impact of the overall building. So an EPD is basically can be defined as an independently verified and registered document that provides transparent and comparable information on the environmental impact across a product lifecycle assessments. So there are different types of EPD. This is an example of one, but if we look into what they contain, they are different, what we call program operators, or companies, organizations that issue the EPD, and they can look a bit different, but they all contain the same information. But first, let me just talk to you through the different life cycle stages. So EN 15804 has created a definitions and a process by which you can look at the different life cycle stages of a product. So you've got stage A, B, C, and D. So A at product level is A1 to A3, covers the materials extractions, transport to factory, and manufacturing. This is what we call cradle to gate. You then have A4, which is transport to site, A5, which is construction, module B, which is looking at the product within the building, and then the operation phase, which is the operational energy use, B6, and operational water use. Then you've got the end of life stages, and then you've got future benefits beyond the life cycle. According to the standard and the latest version, which is called A2, it's mandatory to report A1 to A3, C1 to C4 plus D, and for luminaires, it's also, or electronic goods, it's also mandatory to report B6. The rest are optional. They provide some interesting information that can then be used at building level, but they are optional. So looking at an EPD, as I say, they all look slightly different depending on which program operator has published them, but they all contain the same information. So you always have a front page which states the name of the program operator who issued it. It has this logo here, which is Eco Platform, and it has the name of the manufacturer. It has a photo of the product, and it also states the standard reference of the product that has been used for creating the EPD. Then if you look into the document, you've got a lot of text, and the text is quite important to look at. So you've got product descriptions. And it's really important that when manufacturers create EPD, they write the product descriptions in a way that will be understood by somebody who doesn't necessarily understand their product and explains very clearly what is covered into this EPD. And I mention that because quite often I read EPD and the product description has been written in a jargon that is difficult to understand for somebody who doesn't know the product very well. There's a lot of important information in there, but I like to point out also that you have a declared unit. So in this case, it's a luminaire, it's 1 unit, but you might also have a functional unit. Okay, so in this case, it's 1 unit that provides lighting that delivers an outgoing artificial luminous flux of 1,000 lumens during a reference lifetime of 35,000 hours. Okay, so it's a slightly different way of providing information of the product, but it's really important to explain what is the function of the product within the context of its use. You'll also find a flow diagram. So this is just an example of one. There is no specific template. They always need to show the information and guide the reader through giving them a better understanding as to how that product has been created, manufactured, but also what has been included into your EPD. So never overlook too much these sections, I think. And then you've got the table of results, which is usually what people go straight to. They go straight to that table of results. You've got loads of pages of table of results, but you've got the first one, which contains the information about GWP. So you've got GWP total, so that's global warming potential total, which is expressed in kilogram CO2 equivalent for the unit, the declared unit or the functional unit that has been mentioned earlier. Now, the GWP total in the later version of EN 1584, so the plus A2, splits carbon under 3 different sections. So the sum of the 3 will give you the value in the total. Okay, and it's quite often important to report this information separately, and that's because if you biogenic carbon, so that's the carbon from that you benefit from if you have a product which has sequestrated carbon throughout its life, for example, a timber product, you might have quite a large value here, which will bring the total down. And so this is what the industry like to see, is the split of these different numbers. But quite often, the total value, A1 to A3, is the value that people are interested in finding into your EPD. what is important to know is that you don't need to do one EPD for each product that you have. You can create a product for an EPD, sorry, for a product family. So I was looking at an EPD, for example, for a metal ceiling tiles, which it was all the products were the same. It's just the perforation rate was different. So more holes, bigger holes means less metal. So you can create scaling tables for this type of products. You can create scaling tables for a luminaire, for example, and so you can start grouping different products together. So you don't have to worry about doing one EPD for every single permutations of your product. It doesn't really help anyone in finding thousands of different EPDs that are for different products that actually look very, very similar, and it makes it very hard to find. What is very important is the scaling tables are easy to understand and it's clearly explained. So the process of getting an EPD, you conduct an LCA study. You then take this report, which contains a lot of confidential information, into an EPD report, which does not contain the confidential informations, but is based on the LCA results. That report is basically what we call an unverified EPD, which is sent to a verification program, a program operator, who verifies the information independently. And then once everything has been answered, all the queries been responded to, then it's being published on their website. And the thing that is really important is that data collection form. So in order to carry an LCA, you will need to collect a lot of data. That can take a bit of time. It's important to start early in the process and get that through, but we can help you. To do this part, the conduct the LCA part and the EPD report, you can either have an LCA consultant that helps you through, or you can find some software such as One-Click LCA, for example. You then find the program operator to verify your EPD, and then you go back responding to queries. I do suggest quite often that you start by looking into the program operator you want to work with. They don't have to be based in the UK. You can choose the program operator that you wish, and then work backwards to kind of understand who would be the best consultant or tool to help you. What I would say about a program operator is I would strongly advise that they are recognized by this organization called EcoPlatform. Okay, so EcoPlatform, I put the link here. You can find the link to all the program operators that are recognized by EcoPlatforms. That means they have gone through a process, a rigorous process to certify and check that their verification process is robust enough. They also provide you with a list of all the EPD that have been published. So that's a live number. So if you go today, that number will probably be different. And then you can find loads of EPD that are being published onto this database. So it's quite a useful reference point. Just quickly looking into how we can support you, FIS and Recolight have been running some training courses. It's a one-day training course face-to-face where we go through the process of understanding in more details what I've explained to you today, but this goes into a lot more information, a lot more details, chances to ask questions. So if you're interested, then let me know. We also provide a lot of support through getting you through to the process of an EPD. It is quite a complex process, but you know we can talk you through. We work with One-Click LCA, so we can help you with this. And we also take you through the whole process of looking into the data, help you optimize your product grouping. So as I say, kind of understanding how you can group different products together so you don't end up creating more EPD than necessary. More EPD means more cost, as you can imagine. We can create the LCA report and the unverified EPD for you, and we support you through the whole verification process. We work with One-Click LCA, and the verification the program operator, my apologies, who does the verification is the EPD Hub, which is recognized by EcoPlatform. I would say the cost of an EPD varies depending on the life cycle stages included, above and beyond the mandatory one that I mentioned, and depends on how many EPD you want to do because there's a scaling factor. But they start between roughly about £8,000 for one EPD. So please get in touch if you want to know more about it. So that's an email address you can use to send any queries, and equally for advice members, I'll be happy to respond to questions. So that's everything for me, and I'll hand over to Rachel.
Thank you, Flavie. That was a really great comprehensive overview. Let me just share my screen. Great, hopefully everybody is able to see that now. So I'm here to share with you the architect's perspective. So as a little introduction, I am a trained architect. I joined Orms almost 10 years ago now, but I now run a small sustainability consultancy within the practice. So sustainability has always been a passion of mine, and using the architect's hat, we realized there was a lot of opportunity that we were missing, even working with sustainability consultants. So the practice has been on quite a journey over the past couple of years to upskill and to enable us to design better buildings, really, is our goal. So where we start with carbon is we're thinking about it from the very start of any project. So stage 1, stage 2, we're starting to wonder what the carbon impact of the development is going to be. You've probably heard lots of different carbon targets being mentioned in industry recently. Now you will be hearing designers at early stages talking about the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. This is the gold star now, I would say, for carbon targets in industry. So this will allow the team to set their project carbon target, calculate that and set that. It means then we are replacing LETI, UKGBC, REBA that you may have mentioned previously. I just have a screenshot here. There's plenty of resources on their website, including some webinars that go through it in more detail. But they do set limits for the upfront embodied carbon and the operational energy of the scheme. So that's a framework that we're working within. It does sit alongside the GLA and planning targets. At the moment, they're ever so slightly different because policy takes a while to catch up, but the expectation is that these will be migrating to align with the standard. So once we've figured out what our total project budget is, we then start to apportion that out. This is really useful for us for working with other disciplines initially. And it also differs slightly about things we might be getting specific about early on versus things we might be getting specific about later on. So you can see here we have a base budget set and then our developing budget. So where we're looking to reduce carbon in key areas. We'll always have a little allowance for uncertainty that's sort of built in through the methodology. And then you can see, depending on the scope of the project, so this will be a retrofit project that has quite a big new extension. And so there's still quite a substantial superstructure and substructure allowance made. And you can see then we can give these targets to the structural engineers. So they can be working away in their packages and checking that they're sitting within these budget ranges. At early stages, we're looking very, very closely at our facade. And we would also be looking quite closely at the services and giving that figure to the MEP. For things like finishes and fit out and equipment, we normally are setting benchmark targets. So we're saying roughly this is what an Orms building would look like. We do some calculations at the end of the work stage, say at stage 2, just to confirm those assumptions, but those aren't worked through in detail because certainly at stage 2, we're focused on planning, we're focusing on the facade detail and the structure to support that. So that's how we would be using it at an early stage. Now, the methodology that we have to use is this one. It's called the RICS, Whole Life Carbon Assessment for Built Environment, and many of you may already be familiar with it. It's been around a long time. The first version, I think, came out in 2017, and a second version came out in 23 and came into effect a couple of years ago in 2024. It's incredibly detailed. This is just one of their contents pages, and it went from a 40-page document to a 250-page document. So it's maybe not one to read cover to cover, but if you are working with designers or teams, contractors that are using whole life carbon assessments, it is worthwhile having a little skim, at least of the opening chapters, so you can kind of understand the context that they're working within. The thing I want to draw your attention to is at early design stages, we must look at a prediction of scenarios based on default data. So we're not actually using detailed product specific EPDs at that stage. We're not allowed to. There's two reasons for this. The first is we want to prevent any misleading figures, and we want to allow a buffer while that sort of certainty of procurement is still unknown. So what was happening was a lot of projects were putting in all these low carbon materials, which is a great idea, but they weren't procuring them, and they didn't really realize the cost or the difficulty of getting their hands on them. And then it meant when they were getting to site and that wasn't happening, the post-completion assessment was going up dramatically. And local authorities in particular, who had consented to these schemes on the basis that they were going to be low carbon, were very frustrated that then suddenly the project came back with sometimes a doubling of the total carbon that it had consumed. So to avoid that, we have to use these default specifications. Now, RICS does give us very detailed specs for some materials, particularly things like structure. On others, it sort of leaves it to the assessor to make those assumptions. And then this kind of brings us to the point on different EPD types. So there's, broadly speaking, 3 types. The first is a product-specific EPD, which is really what Flavie has been talking to, where you have put a lot of work into putting together the data for your specific product or product range. You then get the more general ones like a manufacturer-specific EPD, where they might have one generic EPD that covers a lot of their product ranges, but maybe not the specific products that you're looking at. And then you would end up with an industry or a generic EPD. This could be the platform, OneClick, has put together some data for, say, a precast concrete facade, or you might have an industry coming together. So in the early days, this was especially popular because it shares the cost between a number of manufacturers. So for example, the UK precast contractor concrete industry came together and they had a generic EPD for their range of products. So it's using averages of data. So at these early stages, we are obliged to use the generic data. So country level or the software specific ones, or where RICS determines it. For example, the iStructD have issued some that align with the RICS requirements for structural data. Once we get past stage 2, we are then allowed to start integrating products that have specific EPDs. So you can see here, prediction of scenarios based on specific data as the products are specified and purchased. Strictly speaking, we shouldn't really be incorporating them until the end of stage 4, when procurement is happening and we're absolutely sure. However, at stage 2, that is normally on an Orms project. I appreciate some people are going for planning at stage 3, but at stage 2, that's where you're sort of setting your public commitment to carbon on a project. So our stage 3 assessments and our stage 4 assessments are usually relatively private. The client is the only person who's really seeing those. Sometimes we have to provide an update pre-construction to planning department, and at that point we're allowed to start talking about the specific data. So what you will see in an assessment is the generic data and then a set of opportunities. So this is where we can look at procurement opportunities, low carbon products, swap those in, see what it does to the number and talk to that. But we're not allowed to commit ourselves to that at that early stage. So then how we actually use these EPDs in practice. So the EPDs, both product specific and the absolute generic ones, we use a software called OneClick LCA. I would say amongst the architecture community and the sort of design consultant community, it is probably the most popular software. There is eTool, which is available also and is GLA compliant. So you have to use one of the GLA approved tools if you're going to be doing a carbon assessment for planning. Other disciplines don't necessarily use this. So structural engineers often don't use this because they have, 4 or 5 materials, 4 or 5 different sets of specifications. They run their quantities out of their 3D models and they attribute an EPD against it. So it's quite a simple result for them. For architects, it's a lot less simple. We can end up with thousands of products within our remit. And so we absolutely do use a software like this. It is quite complicated to wrap your head around initially, but actually the crux of it is quite simple. So at the top here, hopefully you can see my mouse, there's an add a resource button. So we would start an assessment, we would click on this, and that opens up the EPD database within one click. So as Flavie mentioned, it's quite important that when you've gone to the trouble of getting an EPD, you do get it added to the database of these products so that designers can see and access them. And equally, if you are working with any designers, you're reminding them that you have one, and you're making sure that they're aware so they can search for it. So we would search the database, we would put in, say, Luminaire, and we would see the ones that come up. We would select the product that is the most useful to us, and then we add that to our assessment. And you see here, I've got a frame, so a structural frame. You can see one of those generic iStructD data points, and then you can see one that looks a bit more specific, but actually it is a generic one as well. So this was a stage 2 assessment, so we're in really, really generic world. We allocate it to which part of the building, so that we're getting our results sort of categorized, so we can benchmark and say, yes, in the structure section, this is how our results are sitting. We input our quantities, and then we select our units. So units are actually really, really important for us. Sometimes we get EPDs that come through in kilograms. That's not a great deal of use for us because, as you know, buildings are measured in meters squared, meters linear, meters cubed, or number of units for something like a luminaire. So it can be really, really useful for the people using your EPDs if you do go to the trouble of translating your declared unit into other units so that they can select from a number of options when they're inputting the EPD. Otherwise, what would mean if it was, for example, a linear light, we would have to go away, figure out what your typical product length is, then figure out what the weight per linear meter is, and then multiply that out to get the total kilo of unit. So it can add a little bit of time and complexity and can be a little bit off-putting. Then there's a few other things that we need to do, such as swapping in transport details. So how far from our site would the product have to travel? And then looking at the service life of the product within the building. And so again, RICS has defaults there, 10, 20, 15 years, that type of thing. Within this as well, we also do a lot of studies. So this is where your products can really come to the fore. So as I said, when we're doing early stage assessments, we're using generic data points. But when we get into stage 3 or even at stage 2, looking for opportunities, we do start to compare different products, particularly if a product has been pushed as being particularly sustainable. So we would search the database, we would add your product plus a couple of other competitor products, and we would review the results. And that can help inform the design decisions around a product, particularly if they seem very similar on paper. Okay, and then when we've done all of this, we then hit save at the top here or calculate, and then this spits out a carbon figure. So you can see here the difference between each of these items that have gone in. And so that's what we would do when we were doing those studies. We would save and we would see, okay, in the installation of lighting, for example, in the building or sanitary ware, this would be the total contribution towards the building comparative to other products. So Flavie's already gone through this in great detail, but the data within the EPD that OneClick is reading is that GWP at the top that she's talked about. I am not familiar with this. I know some architecture practices that maybe aren't offering this as a service, aren't preparing carbon assessments for planning. They don't have a OneClick license. And the reason is OneClick is extremely expensive for us. So we all bear sort of a cost within this world. There is a OneClick planetary product, which is their free product, which you can set up an account, and it is worth having a little look at because it gives you a little bit of a sense of what a designer has to go through in order to do a carbon assessment. So they have a very, very limited database that you can add your products in, but you can have a go at filling in the quantities, looking at transport distance, etc. But what I'm actually growing an interest in is the other bits that we're measuring down here, and in particular, water. So as Flavie mentioned, this is a life cycle analysis. It's looking at a number of environmental impacts. Carbon assessments are looking at just carbon, but of course, a product has much more impact elsewhere. And for the most part, we've kind of been ignoring these impacts as well. And so we've very much been in a carbon blinkered world for the past couple of years. And this is something that we're starting to explore beyond. So the idea of looking at the other impacts of something is called embodied ecological impacts. So not just embodied carbon, but embodied ecological. So what is that wider ecological impact on the environment? And I've been finding it quite useful when thinking about products that maybe a lot of work has been done on reducing their carbon impact, and it can be quite hard to advocate for reusing product versus just buying one new because the carbon impact is relatively low. But of course, if you think about reusing a product, you're probably not causing the same impacts to the environment in terms of soil eutrophication or water consumption and contamination. And a good example of that would be aluminium. So for every 1 kilo of aluminium produced, it produces about 3 kilos of a toxic red mud that needs to be dealt with and isn't really dealt with appropriately yet. So these can start to point to other impacts. And this is something that the UK Green Building Council, the UK GBC, has started to research. So a couple of years ago, they did a piece of work on this, which they published. And it looks at all of the other types. And this is the impact of aluminium, so raw aluminium mining. I've put a little link, appreciate it's very small, but if you Google UKGBC embodied ecological impacts, you'll get to the page and you can have a little click through different types of materials and it talks to the different relative impacts. We're not yet at the point where we're doing embodied ecological impacts for projects, but I do think that that's probably something that you might hear about in the future. And again, your EPDs can contribute to that. So before I hand over, there's a couple of further points I want to make. Although EPDs are third-party verified, the quality of the data can really differ depending from one organization to the other, and mistakes in the data can be made. And we do sometimes pick these up even on OneClick. They've gotten through the OneClick process, and there is actually an issue within the EPD, and that happened to us relatively recently. So we've had to stop using that. We flagged it to the manufacturer, but we've had to stop using that, which can obviously be very frustrating when you've put a lot of time and effort into getting one. Sometimes if the person hasn't told you that there's been an issue with the EPD, sometimes it just gets flagged on OneClick as being an EPD that can't be trusted. And so people would tend to avoid it. So it's always worth having that communication with OneClick to make sure that no sort of flags have been put onto your EPD. Therefore, I would say that selecting an EPD partner who is really high quality is really important. So they're really guiding you through that process. I appreciate that it's a huge amount of work to do it, and it's not dissimilar to us doing our company carbon footprint each year. The first year we did it, it was really, really hard. We were asked for all of this data that we just didn't have. So we had to make some assumptions in some areas, but when we came to redoing it the next time, we had put processes in place to start to interrogate our suppliers, for example, in particular, where their stuff was coming from, how it was getting to us, what we were buying with our money. And we had also started to put processes in place that we could record our impact a lot easier. So what I would say is if you're working through your first EPD and it's really painful, hang in there, do the best that you can, but when it comes to renewal, hopefully you'll have put processes in place to make that easier. Saying that, the EPD is not the be all and end all. With Orms, it absolutely won't prevent a product being used if it doesn't have a product specific EPD. And I certainly don't want to stifle innovation. So often you see lots of amazing products coming to the market that absolutely, in your heart are going to be better for the environment because a lot of thought has gone into the manufacturing process, but perhaps it doesn't have an EPD because it's a huge, burden and cost. So we don't discriminate and we don't prevent products from going into our buildings. You're going to hear now from James about how it can be really beneficial for some of the certification schemes, but there's always a way around it for us. Equally though, if you are a very large manufacturer with a very large marketing budget and you're splashing around that your product has 30% less carbon as your advertising mechanism, I would say that without an EPD, that is really greenwash. So there's a bit of a sweet spot in terms of calling a product sustainable without having any evidence to back it up, but also not wanting to stifle that innovation. So maybe one to debate in the panel Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to James at Willmott Dixon to take you through the contractors perspective. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Rachel. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Just bear with while I share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So thank you for the opportunity to come along and talk to you today. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of how a tier one principal contractor views EPD and how we might use them within our projects and with our customers as well. So I'm James Upstill-Goddard. I'm a senior sustainability manager at Willmott Dixon. Just thought I'd give a very, very quick overview to start with of Willmott Dixon, who we are, what we do. So we are a tier one principal contractor working across England and Wales. We're split into 5 regional businesses, as displayed on the screen there. So those regional businesses deal predominantly with new build construction. We also have an interiors office which works mostly out of London, although it is kind of growing outside of London as well. And that looks at sort of refurbishment, fit out, and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, I work centrally within Willmott Dixon, so I sort of support all of our regional businesses and our interiors business with anything to do with embodied carbon and broader sustainability. So our purpose as a principal contractor, we have a purpose beyond profit. So within our now and never sustainability strategy, we've got kind of three main pillars within that. We've got our brilliant buildings pillar, which is all around delivering buildings that meet our customers' ambitions and needs around net zero, making sure that we're delivering buildings with no performance gap, ideally, low carbon, using sustainable materials, that kind of thing. We aim to improve lives. So through our building lives pillar, we look to engage sort of apprentices and local supply chain, deliver social value on our projects as well. And we also want to obviously enhance the environment for future generations through our Better Planet pillar. And that's not only about reducing the impacts of our operations when we're on site, it's also about making sure that we're actually aiming to leave the environment in a better place than which we found it in the first place. So the legacy of some of the buildings we've delivered. So this slide's probably a few years out of date. There's probably a few more recent projects I could have put on here, but just some examples of some of the work that we've done. So delivered a couple of passive house schools, one secondary school, one primary school. An example also of some of our restoration work for our interiors business, and also work with kind of world-class sort of research facility with the University of Warwick. So we work across all different build sectors, so it's education, healthcare, commercial. We do a little bit of residential as well. So lots of kind of good practice peppered in amongst all that. But in terms of today and the content of today, I wanted to frame this really in the context of building performance. So within Willmott Dixon, I sit within the Brilliant Buildings or the building performance team. And as I said before, that is all about driving low carbon on our projects, whether it's operational or embodied. And Flavie's already touched on the operational and embodied carbon differences. So I'm not going to go into that. But what I would say is that historically, most of our customers, and even so now, I think most of our customers are expecting that there's some kind of operational carbon, there's an operational carbon driver within their projects. So the tenders and the bids that are coming to us, we're often seeing requirements around energy efficiency, around net zero operational carbon. So I've put on the screen that it's kind of old news. It's still very, very important, but it's something that we've become very, very accustomed to delivering for our customers. When it comes to embodied carbon, although as a term it's been around for a few years, I think it's still relatively emerging. It's still a relatively new concept. It's still not that well understood across our customer base. We are seeing it more, but it's still kind of playing second fiddle, I think, to operational carbon. But we are, as I said, we are seeing it more. We are seeing 1 or 2 customers coming through with real aspirations around driving low embodied carbon. And there's also an increased need for sort of reporting through some of our procurement frameworks as well. So we procure a lot of particularly public sector jobs through procurement frameworks. There's a few key examples on the screen there, and a couple of those in particular, the Department for Education and the NHS, through its Procure 23 framework, have got quite strict embodied carbon requirements now that we need to meet. So the key customers of ours, and also customers that go through other frameworks such as SCAPE, such as Southern Construction Framework, also have requirements to meet around embodied carbon. So the whole kind of thing's shifting really. We've gone from embodied carbon not really being kind of front and center to kind of growing and more kind of customers and frameworks kind of getting on board with it as a concept. So I think in the industry there's been a shift from sort of what I would sort of team as from sort of claims to evidence. So the graph on the screen there shows a bar chart of the growth in numbers of registered construction EPD. And as you can see, that's risen exponentially over the last 15 years or so. And that graph's actually about 18 months out of date now. So if we drew another line on for January 2026, that figure would be potentially up towards 60,000-ish would be my guess. So there's been a massive increase in the amount of registered EPD that are out there. And what that enables us to do is that it enables us to move more from making generic assumptions about how a product and therefore a building will perform to using product specific data to really giving more clarity around what we expect that building to look like in terms of its performance. We've gone from having broad sustainability claims towards a third-party disclosure. We've already seen from Rachel and Flavie that EPD are externally verified. So it's giving us that credibility. And we're moving more from, I think, just reporting our carbon impacts to actually being able to be in a position where we can look to improve, we can look to reduce the carbon impacts, and we can do some comparisons, compare product A versus product B versus product C, to make sure that we're picking the optimum solution, really. So why do we ask for EPD within Willmott Dixon? So I think there's a couple of main reasons. I think first and foremost, they turn product claims into usable project evidence. I talked on the previous slide about having robust claims. If we're wanting to demonstrate to our customers the carbon performance of their building, having the robust claims and the robust data to sit behind any claims that we make, it gives us confidence that what we're telling our customers is correct, but it also gives our customers confidence that actually what we're telling them is accurate and it is how their building's performing. It also helps avoid greenwashing. I think Rachel touched on greenwashing before. I think if we've got that confidence, we've got that robust data to sit behind the claims we're making, I think that helps reduce that risk. We've got to be really careful with some of this greenwashing stuff. There's a product that we use quite a lot on our jobs. It brought out a low carbon alternative and it was claiming 50% embodied carbon reduction, which sounds great. But when you started looking into it, although the 50% embodied carbon reduction wasn't incorrect, it was applying to one specific component of a system, and that specific component couldn't be used in isolation. It had to be used as part of the system. So actually, when you look at the entire system, the reduction's far less. So it gives us that kind of understanding and that ability to really interrogate the data and make sure that what we're claiming is correct. And there's also an EPD element to lots of the certification schemes. So lots of our customers now chasing certification under things like BREEAM. LEED is probably less so. SCAR's probably less so as well, but probably I think there's a handful of projects that would be looking at that. Particularly BREEAM's the big one though, and obviously procurement frameworks I've kind of already mentioned. So there's a lot of focus around some of these things as well that we need to be demonstrating that evidence towards. They also enable us to quantify and reduce impact. So I always tell people in my business, colleagues of mine, it's not just about measuring the impact of our building. A customer might come to us and say, I want you to do an embodied carbon assessment of Willmott Dixon on my project. Obviously, we'll do that, but what do we do with the results? We get these results through, we get a report come through from a one-click LCA assessment. What do we then do with them? How do we act on those? It's about doing something with it. Rachel touched on the generic data sets, which we have to use early on in design. And they're great because at that point, we're building a school, we're building a hospital. We don't know lots of detail around what that's going to look like, so we can use, we've got some concrete in the foundations, we've got a steel frame, we might have a precast up floor, whatever it might be. They give us a rough yardstick and a feel for where that building might fall in terms of its carbon impact. But when we can start replacing those with specific EPDs, we move through design, we get into a position where we can do more comparisons. We've got more sort of understanding around sort of the unit, the scope that we're working towards. It enables us to firm up the carbon of that building and what the impacts will be. So how we use them, I think there's a couple of things here. I think the earlier data is available, the more useful it becomes, and it comes down to this: what you can't measure, you can't affect, you can't manage, you can't reduce. In design stage, we do whole life carbon assessments. A lot of our customers now, those that are asking for embodied carbon, are looking at early stage design assessments, and quite often further assessments as we move through design as well. So that through doing those assessments, through using specific data in those assessments, it really enables us to hone in on what we call carbon hotspotting. So where the main impact areas are, which are the elements of our building that we really need to focus on if we're going to deliver a low carbon building. That then helps us engage with our supply chain appropriately around which products and materials we might use. When it comes to specifying products, we can look at requesting products with current and relevant EPD, doing those comparisons. At the procurement point, it helps us better understand the impact of those purchased goods and services. This is a piece of work that's ongoing within Willmott Dixon at the moment. I'm sure many other main contractors and businesses are the same. The impacts of purchased goods and services is massive. It's about 98% of our scope 3, which scope 3 is about 99% of all Willmott Dixon emissions. So it is absolutely huge. And if we can get into a position where we really understand what we're buying, we've got the data from EPD to support the carbon impact of what we're buying, then we can give some robustness and some clarity around what the impact of our purchased goods and services are. And that's something some of our customers are looking at. Just last week, we had a request come through from one of our major customers asking questions around how we measure our purchased goods and services emissions and what we're doing about it. So again, if we've got the EPD to feed into that process, we can respond to that question with real clarity and give them some confidence. But also, as the kind of the final point, I think, is a building handover. We're building an evidence pack for the customer. When we hand that building over, if we have EPD for the products and materials that go into that building, then we're giving the customer some real clarity around this is the impact of your building. This is what happens in the in-use phase of your product in terms of carbon impacts. If you do your replacements or whatever it might be, this is what happens at the end of the building's life, or this is what the EPD tells us will happen. So it gives us that real evidence pack for the customer, and that supports other things like materials passports and things which are sort of fast coming on the agenda in construction. So I think for us, while getting EPD late in the design process is great because it can help with a lot of that reporting, actually if we get them early, then that can really help to support carbon reduction ambitions that we have, and ultimately that's what it's all about. So in terms of our customer ambitions, I'll just touch on a few certification schemes. Apologies, there's a lot of text on this slide. I'll probably focus more on BREEAM because that's the one that we tend to get most of our sort of interest around. A lot of customers coming to us now with ambitions to get to BREEAM Outstanding, BREEAM Excellent, and because they're chasing high performing buildings under those schemes, they're having to squeeze absolutely every credit they possibly can within those certification schemes. So every credit that they can get becomes really, really important. Within BREEAM, there's a specific credit, MAT 02, which is around EPD. You need to score 20 points to score the credit. And I've put up there how many points a product-specific EPD is, a multi-product EPD is, and an industry average is worth in terms of points. So as you can see, you need a lot less product-specific EPD to score the points than you would if you were using a generic industry average, let's say. So hopefully that kind of shows that for our customers' perspective, if they're wanting to score that credit, if we can put forward some product-specific EPD, it's much more easier for us to score that point, which is really important to the customer. In terms of SCAR, I think EPD helps, it's around providing that robust environmental data to support product selection. So I think, when we're selecting fit-out materials, it's about demonstrating, again, that credible evidence. And an EPD gives us that confidence. It gives us that confidence that we can benchmark some performance. And I think it's more, not just do you have an EPD, but what does that EPD tell us about its performance? And I think that's something that we're kind of, beginning to think a little bit more about now is, okay, we've got an EPD, that's great. Actually, what does it mean in practice? And slightly different angle, the DFE CF 25 framework. So this is their new construction framework 2025, which came out very, very recently, last couple of months or so. That has got a much bigger focus on embodied carbon. So all schools and colleges that go through that procured through that framework, so DFE projects, now have embodied carbon targets applied to them, and those targets will reduce as we go through the framework. The framework will run from between 6 to 8 years. The DFE anticipate putting around £15 billion worth of work through that framework, so it's worth a lot of money to all the contractors on the scheme. It's not just ours, but it's lots of the other main contractors on the scheme as well. It's a massive customer for us, and it's a massive the projects we deliver for them is a lot of our work. Beyond just the embodied carbon targets, the DFE have also got expectations around EPD. So when we hand a school over under that framework, the DFE expect that 85% by mass of all materials and products in that school will have an EPD available. So that is a huge undertaking. That's something that we've not seen before, but that's clearly where the industry is going. So we need to be able to demonstrate to the DFE that 85% of the stuff in our school has an EPD with it. So that that's going to be a real challenge for us, and that's why when we're procuring and specifying products on a DFE job, we're going to have to look at those partners, some suppliers that have got EPD and can help us meet that target. And finally, with the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, that's got quite strict performance limits in it. That's again a relatively new thing that's come on. We haven't had any customers come to us yet asking for certification to that. However, we have had a lot of interest around aligning to that. So they want to measure themselves against the standard potentially for a future certification exercise or whatever it might be. I think Rachel touched on some of the uncertainty piece before. The use of EPD helps us decrease that uncertainty, basically. So the uncertainty is made up of uncertainties around quantities, material quantities, uncertainties around material types that you might use. Clearly, if you've got some more clarity around the material types, then you can help bring that down. So it just helps firm up and make your calculations more accurate, I think. So just to summarize kind of the key takeaways I would probably leave you with is that for us as a contractor, EPD help us move from just reporting our carbon or our customers' carbon to carbon reduction, actually being able to do something with it. My message to you would probably be to not view EPD as extra paperwork, but as a means of verifying your data. It's a big undertaking. I get it. It sometimes an expensive undertaking, but it's a way of making sure that your data are robust, they stand up, and having that rigor, I think, is really valuable and is becoming increasingly valuable, particularly for the likes of us, where we are going to have to start, particularly for DfE jobs, looking at products more favourably that have EPD. I think in some cases they help us quantify, compare, and reduce embodied carbon. I think hopefully that's come across in my presentation today, and they support presentation under assessment schemes and meeting the requirements of the frameworks on which we're on. But the real value of an EPD is when they inform decisions early. So if we can get those sent through to us nice and early in design before specification and procurement are locked in, then that's when they have that real value. And that's when we can really use them to drive carbon down on the project. So thank you very much for listening to that. I think I'm going to stop sharing now if I can work out how to do that. And I'll hand back to
invite the other panelists to switch on as well. And thank you very much, James, Flavie, and Rachel, for some really, really insightful presentations. I thought, just to kick us off, Iain, how do you see the need for embodied carbon and EPDs affecting members of the FIS?
I think it's still fairly early days, Nigel, in terms of how people are managing embodied carbon through their projects. But we're certainly seeing greater increase in the impact up front, and I think one of the projects that we're collaborating on, reuse scheme, really demonstrates project reuse really demonstrates that, because we are starting. We sat down as a group of fit out contractors probably about 2.5 years ago now, and said, where are we going with reuse? And the conclusion was, we need to get somewhere. We need to do something, and project reuse was born. So I think certainly it's of growing importance, and it's certainly something we're trying to champion as well, because as I say, we fit out such a fast cycle every 7 years. We're stripping stuff out. We've got to be thinking longer term about the decisions that we're making.
Yeah. And Rachel, James, really interesting to hear you talking about carbon budgets for new buildings, embodied carbon budgets. And that's really exciting to see it starting to impact that way. Roughly what proportion would you say of new projects are now looking for that level of granularity and data?
So it's not just new buildings, it will be all projects. So we are primarily retrofit led. So all of our projects, no matter how big or small, has a carbon budget at this point, and that will be the case probably for the last 3 or so years. Whether it's a client brief requirement as well or not, we are still tracking that sort of based on our knowledge. But I have to say, on all of our projects now, it is a client brief requirement to have a carbon assessment at least once or twice per work stage. It's not always planning driven, but that is increasing as well. So if you are a major scheme in London, the expectation is that you will have a carbon assessment included at planning. And now the expectation is that you will be conditioned to meet that target. And it will also end up in the Section 106. So there'll be a legal obligation as well to measure and report that. So I would say for us, it's every project, probably within the architecture profession. There is a trend towards large commercial schemes. So Orms do sort of large offices, hospitality, education schemes. So we would see it in our sector. There is definitely a lack in the one-off residential sector, and that's pretty noticeable if you're, following things like Rebo Awards. People tend not to do it for that small private client. And I'll let James sort of report. He's sort of a few years behind the curve, still inheriting projects that maybe started the design stage 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, so for us, it's very much customer led, and I think we are seeing more come through. I've been with Willmott Dixon now just over 4 years, and certainly when I first joined the business, probably had, we had a relatively small number of projects with embodied carbon targets and aspirations, and even then they were really kind of high level. There wasn't a lot of clarity around what that meant. If they're applying an embodied carbon target, are they looking at upfront carbon? Are they looking at whole life carbon? What exactly do they mean by that? I think now we're seeing a real shift, and I think some of that's driven by some of the frameworks I mentioned before. DFE and the NHS are probably leading on that, but certainly the likes of SCAPE, which is a big framework for us, Southern Construction Framework, now beginning to encourage projects that procure through those schemes to measure carbon. I think that is creating a bit of a shift as well. And we see a real mix. We've seen some customers who come to us with a top level carbon target. We want our school to achieve 550 kilograms of carbon per square meter, whatever it might be. We have some projects that come to us and they have that top level target, but they also break it down. They say that we want, in the foundations, we want no more than X. In the frame, we want no more than Y. We are beginning to see that come through a little bit more, which is a real shift, and really interesting actually, because it does kind of lend a lot more weight to that kind of budget conversation around you've got a specific budget now per almost building element that you need to make sure that you're meeting. So it is moving. It's probably moving slowly, if I'm being honest, but it is certainly moving. I'd anticipate over the next few years when things like the net zero carbon building standards start to have a little bit more teeth, we're going to see a lot more jobs coming through with specific targets applied to them.
Do you mind if I jump in with a question there? Because I think, Rachel, you said something really interesting about how we protect the carbon specification. I think that's always been a concern of mine. If you look at the Building Safety Act, we've got Gateway 2, how are you going to do it? Gateway 3, how did you do it? And I think without sort of certification, it's quite hard to manage, because somebody once said to me, we design in calm, we construct in chaos. And I come from a construction background, and now I realise we design in chaos and we construct in chaos. So it doesn't quite line up. But how important are EPDs to maintaining that thread and measuring decisions throughout the programme? And how can we sort of capture that better so that we do all the great work you do up front, Rachel, ends up on the ground in the building?
Really, really good ERs. I think to what James was saying, they were getting carbon targets through and then sort of hands in the air about, what's the scope of this, and what exactly are you trying to measure? You're saying your carbon target is this number. Is that upfront? Is that whole life? Is it all the modules? So I think in the first instance, being really clear about that, and the second edition of RICS really tightened that up. The net zero carbon building standard also really tightens that up. It's incredibly specific. So any projects, I would say, post 2024 sort of start date that's complying with those, you will see really clear targets and very well articulated about what the team are looking for. And then that needs to be woven through the rest of the ERs. So in terms of the architectural specification, we have to make sure that the products that we have spec'd are meeting those carbon targets and that sort of overall carbon budget. So it is reflective. We can and do use EPDs as part of our reasons maybe for rejecting contractor changes. We normally try to work with our contractors because obviously each of them have their own supply chain. So we try not to be so specific that there's no flexibility for them there. And so that's why the budget piece is also quite important for them to understand this is what the team are broadly looking for. This is how they have thought they're going to get there. We've got to be able to communicate that very well. But it then allows them to intercept and say, actually, in our supply chain, we're going to be able to get hold of this for you, but we won't be able to get hold of that for you. But on balance, the overall figure will be sort of in the right place. So when we are going through the tender process, especially if we're the sustainability consultant, there will be really detailed sustainability ERs put in place that sort of signpost to all of the documentation. So we will put together a summary saying this is the expectation around carbon, circularity, biodiversity, everything. And here are the documents you need to go and read to understand that implication. We then table it as an agenda item at the mid-bid interviews, and then we also will table it as an item at the end of tender interviews. It will also come through in the questions on the tender returns. So we will be getting sort of certainty that somebody within the contractor team has read and digested this, because unfortunately you don't always get that. You get your bid team in the contracting business, and then you get the delivery team. So making sure that that's been fully kind of comprehended and that understanding is there. And then when we move into contract and into construction, we're looking for that evidence that this work is happening. So we'd be looking for the Janes to be attending some workshops. We would be asking for sustainability workshops sort of upfront to reiterate what the targets are around the scheme, not just on carbon, on everything, and asking for them to start working and demonstrating their methodology to us. So we can have quite open and flexible conversations, but equally, if we have, believed in a product, we have invested time and energy in making that happen, perhaps in a finish, the client maybe wants to showcase innovation, we will use carbon as a way to prevent an inferior alternative from being specified, amongst other things. There might be, fire implications or things like that as well.
Thank you.
I would have thought that, yeah, for manufacturers who spent a lot of money on getting an EPD, that would be very very pleasing to hear, actually.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think probably the biggest challenge, frustration for us, I think, on projects is often down to cost. Unfortunately, sometimes it does just come down to a customer's budget. And it's not uncommon for us to have a customer come to us early design with lots and lots of ambitions about what they want to do. But as the cost starts ramping up, unfortunately, inevitably with some of this stuff, the requirements get scaled back and back and back, and before you know it, you're just delivering a bog standard building again. You're not doing anything particularly innovative or low carbon, and that's just the reality of how things are. And I think some of that's driven by understanding. I think sometimes customers don't necessarily understand what they're asking for. They want a low carbon building, but they don't really know what that looks like. They don't know how to get there. So I think there's a whole education piece that we can work on, I think, with customers as well, to kind of support that. But it is a real challenge. It is, I think with the DFEs, I keep picking on DFE, but again, it's a good example of where we've now got those requirements to have EPD demonstrable to the DFE at various different REBA stages, stage 3, stage 4, and stage 6. So it's really important that we maintain that sort of what we call green thread of information, I guess, where you're putting an EPD in place at stage 3 or stage 4. You absolutely can't be getting to stage 5 construction and somebody says it's too expensive, we'll use this one instead, because you then drop off your EPD requirement and all of a sudden you're not meeting your customers' needs. So that's going to be a real driver for us, and I think that'll be interesting to see how that works. But we still do get the challenge, and we still do get, in our internal project teams, some things fall into the too hard box, or they create project delays. And I think you talked about reuse before. Reuse is one that we have a real battle with, because the project teams in some cases don't want to know because it's too difficult, or they perceive it to be too difficult. So it is a real challenge, but I think it's something that we're going to have to keep pushing, and hopefully it'll get easier.
Nigel, if I could maybe add back in as well, I think, James has raised a really important point. We really, as a design team, have a big responsibility on doing our due diligence and our homework before going out to tender. And so it's not fair for us to bung a load of low carbon products in without factoring in things like the cost and the procurement. And a good team will have worked through that. So the client is fully on board with this. They'll have already been speaking with the manufacturers about the specifications that they want, so that when teams are tendering and they're reaching out to discuss the project, that it's a level playing field. I think a big frustration in the contracting industry is teams put all these opportunities in, they do a lot of work during the tender process, and then the opportunities come back with more time or more program than the design team had originally anticipated, and the client just says no. And that's really, I think, just poor form on our part as designers. We need to be putting a lot of effort into that. And that's why part of the reason why we ended up setting up our sustainability consultancy, because we wanted our architects on the projects to be really understanding the implications of their decisions. And our preference is if each discipline actually calculates the carbon of their portion of the project, because then they have a much more robust understanding. There's a much more engaged conversation with the QS who's putting together, these costs of the program, and then there's much more likelihood of it actually being successful. And I think when we do have things like tender options coming in, we do sometimes put carbon reduction opportunities as a tender option because the client is a little bit fearful, or maybe isn't convinced that it's going to be viable. But if the team have done their homework and have kind of prepped the way for that, actually it can be a much smoother journey. And then it's much easier for, James and his colleagues to come along and say, yep, we can deliver that product. You kind of know what you were after. And it's a much more positive conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. I think our first question is a question and an answer that's coming on the Q&A, is both a question and answer, which is, does developing a carbon budget carried out at each design stage? I think I know what I mean.
Yeah, so we would develop a carbon budget at the start. So we're looking at those upper limits. So the net zero carbon building standard is a wee bit complicated in that there's new build targets and retrofit targets. So if you're doing a part new build, part retrofit, you've got to do a bit of a blended calculation. So it can be a bespoke target. It will be a bespoke target for each project. So that's sort of our starting point. What is that ultimate target? We know we can't, it's a limit. We can't go above it. And then we look at our apportionment out of that. So that's the carbon budgeting. And usually it's a little like financial budgeting, roughly speaking, how much are we planning to spend on this package? And so we would do that as a starting point. And then during the earlier design stages, we probably focus more on design studies to kind of confirm our assumptions in there. So particularly as architects, we would be spending a lot of time on design the facade. We would maybe take a look at one bay and then sort of multiply that out across the facade to make sure that we're staying within our carbon budget as that design is developing. Then at the end of the work stage, we'll do the whole carbon assessment. We usually want to wait until we get the cost plan in, because the cost plan has the quantities and that's sort of settled at that point. We can start doing the assessment before we get the cost plan. And that can be really beneficial for the client in terms of program, and obviously getting the info sooner means you can incorporate it into the design. But it's a bit chicken and egg. You can end up spending a lot of time trying to work with shifting quantities. So our preference would be to wait until the cost plan comes in. Then when the cost plan comes in, we get that sort of certainty, albeit it's predicted at this point, but we get some sort of assurance that we're sitting within our carbon budget. We may, as with a financial budget, adjust that carbon budget throughout the design stages. So we may find actually our budget had allowed X amount for facades, but in reality, the design is going to take this. So we now need to find savings elsewhere in the building. Maybe the structural engineers have been able to do something, there's less structure needed than we had assumed, so we can take a bit of budget out of that and reallocate it. And then at each work stage, stage 3, stage 4, it's sort of the same process. We have that budget, we have the previous stages assessment, and we're starting to look at and track changes as we're working through that stage. So if there's a major redesign of something, facade, structure, extra floor has appeared, we will be factoring in what the carbon impact of that is and reporting to the client on how that's going to help or hurt the budget. So we're constantly honing the carbon budget because it's a useful, I suppose, set of parameters and boundaries during the design stage to keep everybody on track. But we're doing that sense check, ideally at the end of each work stage. So there'll be a stage 3 assessment and then a stage 4 assessment. And then, from stage 3 onwards, you're kind of hoping that you're really just focusing on the technical design. So the budget shouldn't be flexing all that much. It's more about the product specification. But obviously, stage 4 is a really important procurement period, and it's when we will be having those more detailed conversations. We would start procurement conversations at stage 2. If we're looking for opportunities that maybe involve reuse or low carbon products, we will be articulating to the client what the real implications are of that choice and that decision. So they should be fully prepared for it at stage 4. And then when we're at stage 4, we're trying to finalize those specifications. We're kind of finalizing that carbon budget. And then we have a carbon assessment that sort of dovetails with it. So when we're going into contract, both documents can become employees' requirements. So you're saying, this is the upper limit that you're contractually obliged to meet. This is how we're figuring we're going to portion that out. This is the specification that backs it up. These are the results of that specification showing you how we've met it. And then that's when you can say, okay, discuss.
Thanks, Rachel. Another question on the Q&A, probably directed to you in the first instance, Flavie. What advice would you give to a decorative lighting company that approximately 60 to 70% of their output is bespoke? So the questioner says, look, in a few cases, the budget could absorb the cost of an EPD, but 9 out of 10 times the client's timeline can't. So what can they do in that situation, do you think?
Well, so I think it would be, every product is always a little bit bespoke in some ways. So this is where you can actually group things together. You can create, an EPD that kind of focuses on one particular products, and then you look at the variations, and you can put the scores in the scaling table at the back of the EPD in the appendices. That you perfectly, it's allowed to do this sort of thing. So you can actually cover quite a large number of products. You could also look into the different components, because usually if it's bespoke, it's actually made of some standard components. So you could look into the different components, get the data for those, and then you create your different products as you go along. There is it is a process you have to go through. You have to collect some data, but I think talking to somebody who really understands how to put it together, you can actually spend more time upfront to really put it together in a way that makes sense, and group quite a lot of products together. It's not an unusual situation at all. So I think it's worth a chat basically in the first instance, is what I would say. In terms of getting the internal LCA, there's something that I'll pass on to James and Rachel and see what they accept. But the other thing is that you can work with a consultant the first time to collect the data, and then you can work with some tools directly and do the EPD yourselves. From experience, I would say just be careful about going straight with the tools, because they are not that simple. An EPD is a process, and you could end up spending a lot of time. But once you've done a few with a consultant, engage with the process, understand how it works, then you can go and do some yourself to respond to the very bespoke bits.
Yes, we will accept an unverified EPD. However, one click won't. So we won't be able to load it into our carbon assessment. What we do, this is a really, really common issue we have with all MEP, because air handling everything is built bespoke. So I would say have a look at CIBSE TM65. And so that's methodology for calculating the embodied carbon of services. And it effectively, there's different types of forms that we would send the manufacturer and ask you to fill out. And so it looks at the weight of the stuff that's in there. So if you've got a metal, how much do you have in this particular thing? And then it allows us to sort of break that down and add an EPD against it. As Flavie said, if you can do a little bit of the homework, and for example, if you typically use the same product supplier for your stainless steel or your copper or whatever you're using, and you've got your EPD for your ingredients, then we can make the cake kind of on a bespoke basis in one click, and that's absolutely fine. It's a bit of a headache, but we're causing a headache by specing a bespoke product, so we kind of work with that.
Thanks. And George Frey asks a similar question. Again, a product that's highly configurable, so I guess it's again bespoke. What's the practical and accepted route to provide project-specific carbon data that contractors, James, architects, Rachel, and sustainability consultants can genuinely trust?
Hard to say without knowing exactly what product you're talking about. You can
Sorry,
get
a freestanding bespoke meeting system.
freestanding bespoke meaning system. Okay. So you might do a system EPD, or you might break your system into its component parts. So for example, initially, SAS, the ceiling metal ceiling manufacturer, they did, I think, an EPD for their tiles and then an EPD for the framework system. And then they figured out actually it's easier. We kind of know how much framework on average ends up holding up a tile. So they were able to say we can do sort of a system EPD, and then just think about if it's scalable, how people would do that. So typically you probably have a height of your system, maybe it has a bit of a roof. Does it have a length? And so it may be if your system is more of a wall product, you would say, well, at this height and then the linear length. So a unit would be really useful as maybe meter squared, and that would be sort of the vertical surface area of that unit. And you would say typically that would include this amount of framing and this amount of paneling. And you may well have, manufacturing limitations on that anyway. It means that it'll never be 100% perfect, because depending on the design, there might be more framework or less framework. But perhaps that's where you could sort of give scaling factor as well. So this used to happen. Rockwool had a scaling factor in their EPD. A little bit dangerous if people don't know that it's there and aren't using it properly. But because their product is the same product, it's the same ingredient, just the different densities, they would say for this product range, multiply your quantity by 1.5, multiply your quantity by blah, blah, blah. So you may well decide that there's some components that are quite high carbon, like a metal framing, and that should be calculated separately. And you can provide that calculation to say, in your design for your project, this is the amount of framing. And then there's the, the glue that holds it together. And then that's just sort of surface area. So thinking about it in that sort of approach, are you going to hurt somebody because you've got some high carbon elements in there and they might be over calculating? And then if so, can you split that out? And maybe it's two EPDs that work together to form the system.
Yeah, thanks. So Greg Bristol from ASD Lighting points out that they're an SME and they also would have significant financial issues with trying to get all their families of products, let alone all their products, with an EPD. And so Greg is asking what alternative sources of data would be acceptable. So, for example, TM65.2 from CIBSE and the SLL. And how do those sit, and how would you compare them with an EPD?
Is that for me as well?
Yeah, Rachel, and in fact, and anyone else who wants to chip in, please. Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Nigel. Can you just repeat the start of the question again?
So it's basically, if you can't get an EPD done, are there alternative data sources that you as an architect, James as a contractor, would be comfortable in using and justifying, and how do they sit against an EPD?
Yes, and how do you prioritize as well? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, TM65 we will accept. And then that sort of puts a lot of the homework around the EPDs back on us. So you're just providing a breakdown of weights of your biggest contributing materials, and then we do that. Honestly, getting TM65 out of manufacturers is nigh on impossible. We will email them all, and we might get a couple of emails back. And out of that, then a handful will actually respond. So if you are even doing that, you're getting a gold star in my book. I would then say, in terms of the cost, I completely understand. And, Flavie might also have a little bit to say on this. I would say start with your most popular product. If you're going to invest in an EPD, start with your most popular, or maybe consider, is it sort of something that can be grouped? So as Flavie said, if you've got a family of products, like a linear light, if it's a lighting manufacturer, that's all from what they start with, because you do one, but actually you've got loads and loads in that range, and it's usually your best seller. So it's a great starting point. Or is it that it's a component within all of your systems? So you might say, okay, we're providing TM65. In the TM65, generally speaking, it's a standard stainless steel, there's a standard aluminium, there's a standard XYZ. The bit that's really niche to us is this part, like the luminaire part, and we've got an EPD for that is scalable, and we can talk you through. So you might be replying with your TM65, and 5 out of the 6 materials you don't have an EPD to put against it, or you've searched out there in the world and you found an appropriate EPD that's reflective of the impacts of those, and then you're only paying for the one bespoke EPD that suits your very specific product that you want to showcase. And it's also, if you've done that work in reducing your carbon impact, I think a great thing that we see from EPDs is people do the LCA for the first time. They realize, oh gosh, there's actually quite a lot of impact in that subcomponent or in that thing. And then it starts a much broader conversation within the business about how we're making our things and can we look for carbon reductions. So that's actually a fantastic exercise. If you can do that without getting the EPD, that's a fantastic exercise. That's, really positive. Holistically speaking, that's a real positive going forwards.
Can I just come in quickly, Nigel? I think what is really important is that, yes, TM65 might kind of serve certain purposes. It might help with some applications and perhaps, for doing life cycle, the whole life carbon of building assessments. But you have to be careful whether that's accepted in different schemes as well, in different certifications. So this is maybe, I'm not sure how BREEAM looks into TM65, for example, for products. But I think the demand for EPD, you're right, there is a cost with it, but there's a huge trend and an increase in the number of EPDs. So just be a little bit careful in the choice. The TM65 might be a good first step for you to get onto the market, but I think eventually moving towards the EPD process is, and I'm saying that objectively, is actually quite a good thing, because I think you'll see the demand for it increase as we move forward. So it's a good first step into the journey, rather than the end point necessarily.
I'll just throw a couple of cents in as well, if I may. So, you know, in a past life, I put EPD together, so I kind of know what's involved. I'm aware of how time intensive, how resource intensive that can be, and probably we've been guilty, out of probably the wider contracting industry. You know, some of our peers, some of our competitors have probably been guilty of just requesting EPD as a blanket. Give us an EPD, or you know, you need to provide us with an EPD for this material or product. I don't necessarily think that's always the right approach. This is probably a little bit at odds with what I was saying around the DFE. But you know, an EPD is just because you've got an EPD, it doesn't mean that you're performing well environmentally. And I think that's really important to bear in mind. An EPD is just a way of validating your data, validating your performance data. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're smashing it in terms of your environmental performance. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to discourage, you know, some of our supply chain. And we know that there are some supply chain partners on our supply chain doing great stuff, really innovative, low carbon stuff. They don't have EPD, but we're certainly not going to stop working with them because they don't have one. So it's just really important to kind of understand that, I think, and appreciate the EPD. And you know, while they're important, and in some applications they are very important, they're not always the be all and end all. I think that's one really important thing to bear in mind. So we're always open to you know, particularly with those kind of companies, understanding what are they doing, you know, what have they measured, where are they with this thing, and almost kind of supporting them through it in some cases as well. So you know, it's not a shut door at all if you haven't got an EPD.
Okay, and I said we'd finish at 12:30. Can we sneak in a one final question from Ali K, asking Rachel particularly about the UK net zero carbon building standard and the fact that it gets more ambitious year on year. Will you be looking for lighting to continue to decarbonize year on year as well, or are you expecting other products to do more of the heavy lifting? Put us on the spot, Rachel.
Yes, please. If you could all decarbonize together, that would be marvelous. It's obviously proportional to the scale of impact. So we'll be looking for other products that maybe we have more of, things like your concrete, your steel. Will have a lot of work to do. But what I would say is the standard is looking for two things. It's looking for manufacturers to innovate, to learn how to use less material without affecting the robustness and the durability that then prevents materials from being reused. It's also asking that you are sort of procuring the best materials, you know, as the subcomponents or the ingredients in your cake that's out there. So generally speaking, there is an expectation that the UK electricity grid, for example, will continue to decarbonize. That will continue to benefit you. So even if you did nothing to change your product from year 1 to year 4 when you have to recertify, you will see a reduction there if you're using UK electricity because the grid has decarbonized. And then the same should be if you're buying local materials that are all made in the UK, that should be true of all of the sort of ingredients gone into your cake. So we've seen that in our business year on year. Our carbon footprint has been slowly creeping down because each year we get new carbon electricity factors from the government and they're slowly improving. Now, that's not to say that you don't try harder, design better, design for replaceability, you know, do all of the great circularity things, because that's where your product will really come on in leaps and bounds and be able to keep up with the rest of the market. And we didn't really touch on it today, but circularity is a huge growing piece, and being able to refurbish products, retain the value, the carbon value intrinsically within them, and reuse that is enormously important. And maybe as my closer, if I can advocate that, if you can really think about that circularity piece in your product, and then how can you as a business make money from that? So can you start to offer to take back and refurb your own products and offer that as a service? So you're not making 100% of your revenue from selling new and manufacturing new. You're starting to find a little bit of a balance there, and that will just, in a much more holistic way, improve the market. It will encourage people to buy better quality in the first instance. Your product may actually creep up in cost because you need to invest a little bit more in it initially, but then consumers are seeing sort of that long-term benefit, and certainly from an environmental perspective, it's got a much longer term benefit as well.
Thank you. And your mention of circularity means it would be appropriate to remind everybody that this conversation and more will continue at Circular Lighting Live on the 8th of October. But with that, thank you so much to Flavie, Rachel and James. Really insightful comments, really appreciated. And thank you, Suzanne, behind the scenes for keeping us all operational. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.